Good afternoon, everybody. We're ready to start our afternoon portion of our program today, and we have a very special keynote speaker with us today. Today we have Jerusalem Demsas who is a staff writer for The Atlantic, and she has written on zoning reform and zoning issues across the country. And if you would like to read some of her articles, on your table is a QR code where you can access the information about our program today, as well as read some of her articles from The Atlantic. Don't do it now. And then also we're going to have a Q&A afterwards, so you can be thinking of questions you'd like to ask her after she concludes her remarks. Jerusalem?
Great. If you couldn't tell, that's me. I'm also here. So thank you all for coming out. I'm really happy to be here. I'm really happy to be invited, and thank you so much to the Salt Lake County crew, who has been very helpful, has been driving me around and really showing me the place. And it's not an exaggeration. It's a very welcoming community. So thank you, everyone. I hope to get to know a lot of you. And I travel to a lot of local communities while reporting, and it's one of my favorite things to do. I learned so much from planners, local government officials, residents, and so I hope to learn a lot from you as well and learn from your questions and comments later on. But I'm hoping there's a little bit that I can provide, especially from kind of a national context, when I get to take a step back from, I think, the day-to-day, both politics and policies of how planning, land use work, and see really the cumulative effects and the structural issues and challenges that can be more difficult to grapple with when you're dealing with the work on a day-to-day basis. So I know our previous speaker talked a lot about the way that restrictive zoning can increase prices, so I won't spend a lot of time on that, but I do really want to focus you all on just how high the cost of a single regulation on land use can be. There's a recent paper that just tried to look at the effect of minimum lot sizes, and it looked at two different cities near each other, controlled for a lot of the different confounding variables, just to see what the effect of minimum lot sizes were. And the increase in cost was $30,000 a house. That's for one land use regulation. So I think a lot of the time the conversation is, what is the justification for this individual land use regulation being removed? But I think we need to flip that. There are, of course, many regulations that are valuable and do different things for a community. No one would suggest we should get rid of, for instance, regulations around fire safety or building safety. But the idea that we are defaulting towards keeping regulations that have often really hidden costs that people don't internalize on a daily basis, they don't see it, residents don't see it when they're debating whether or not to accept new developments, is a real problem. $30,000 a house is pricing so many people out of homeownership and access to housing in their communities. Now, I think that one of the big challenges, of course, with land use reform is about growth, right? It's, people often, when they think about why housing is so expensive, they think about the demand side, because that's both what's true in terms of the short-term relevance of their lives, and also it is the most obvious. You see a bunch of people moving in, you see, a lot of change happening in your community, and then you also see home prices skyrocketing. I think that it's the most important thing to note about growth is that it's often very unexpected. One of my favorite anecdotes from early in the COVID-19 pandemic is how most market and industry players believed at the beginning of the pandemic that home prices were going to plummet. Everyone, iBuyers with, millions and millions of dollars in access to capital, sold tons and tons of inventory at the very beginning of the pandemic, believing that there was going to be a massive depreciation in home values across the country. Of course, as we all know now, they were wrong. And it's not because they were stupid. It's not because people are dumb and don't understand housing markets. It's because it's very, very difficult to predict how different events are going to affect growth in housing markets. And that planning, of course, is a very, very difficult enterprise and is never one where you can fully understand the implications of the decisions you're making right now. And which is why, of course, it's important to have a lot of grace for people who've made decisions in the past and that were often working with the best information they had at the time. But I think it is also important to recognize that that means that you have to set up your community to be able to respond to changes in growth quickly and adequately. Supply and land use changes are not about, no one throws up 30,000 units in a year. It's not possible. No one can do that, and you can't zone for that kind of change. What you can zone for is a level of flexibility in the market that makes sure that when things do happen, when there is a run-up in prices, there are developers in your area that already know how to build the kinds of units, a diversity of units that may be necessary for the changing landscape, the changing demographics. And that is one of the biggest challenges right now, is that because we've planned so heavily in most communities just for one or two different types of housing, usually just single-family homes, a couple different kinds of lot sizes, a couple different kinds of setbacks, or maybe large apartment buildings in some urban corridors, we don't create that kind of depth of understanding both in the development community but also in the policy community, in the banking community, financing, to make sure everyone's kind of comfortable with the diversity of housing types that can and should exist. And so it's uncomfortable, right? Because planners often and people who work in local government, they're trying to predict specific needs in their community and meet those needs exactly. But that's not possible when growth is so unpredictable and you don't know what's going to happen. Another fact that I like to underscore here about how unpredictable growth is that in the 1990s, Cleveland was actually outpacing both the national average and San Francisco in house price growth. At the time, the smart choice for home buying, the place where you thought a lot of growth was going to happen, is in Cleveland, Ohio. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about here, where it's really difficult to make these kinds of long-term bets on different places and how they're going to look, and that flexibility is really, really important in zoning codes. So, I think that the really big problem that I want to outline, though, is just what happens when communities don't plan for growth. Because I'm sure you've seen this in your own communities, but I've seen this across the country. It really tears apart the fabric of a community very, very quickly. When people feel like there's a scarcity of something so important to them like housing, when they feel that crunch and they feel this kind of pressure and frustration from outsiders, it turns ugly really, really fast. The best example of this, I think, is when you look at what happened when Afghan refugees were needing to be resettled in the United States. I know that Utah is a place that has prided itself on trying to resettle refugees. There are a lot of progressive cities across the country that they themselves believed themselves to be places that cared about refugees, that cared about resettling them, that wanted to, honor the commitments we'd made to people who had helped us in a long and costly war. And when the State Department released its unofficial list of places that could house refugees, not a single one of these broadly progressive liberal cities were on it. Not New York City, not San Francisco, not Los Angeles, none of them, because there's not housing available. So you can have all of these kind of theoretical commitments all you like, but if you don't create the structures available to make sure you can manage growth and plan for it, and make sure that when there's unexpected changes in needs, that's not going to pit community members against each other, it's going to mean that they're willing and able to open up their arms, you're going to land in the same problem here that has already happened in so many countless cities across the country. And I think that this is also something we've seen a lot with homelessness as well. You see rising homelessness rates in a lot of these progressive cities across the country, and the speed with which people turn against homeless populations and turn towards punitive measures that have no evidence of actually reducing the problem is really remarkable. And it's not that these people are bad, it's not that the residents of these cities are terrible and heartless, it's that they have been in a housing environment for decades now that does not supply them with the level of affordability and calm and future planning and just belief that they'll have a future for themselves and their kids. And that leads to a scarcity mindset, which means you pit yourself against other people who you feel are taking away from you and your quality of life. And I think that is, it's really sad, and that the speed with which that can tear apart the kind of giving community fabric that I think most places prize, and I know from what I've talked to people here is very, very important to a lot of Utahns, is really remarkable, and it can happen very, very quickly. So another point that I want to make here is just this idea that there's not really returning, right? There was this era where you could have large lot size, single family homes that were cheap and plentiful and that were near, urban centers. That doesn't exist anymore, and there is this myth that you can get back to that, and I think we really need to dispel that. There has been the development of the commuting zone to the point where there's very few developable plots of land where there's no one living there, there's nothing currently being used on that land, or that land is not already set aside for something else. And even if it was available, those new properties would be extremely expensive. So we're not getting back to that for a few reasons. One, we've built out the commuting zone of these major cities. Like, cities are economic engines. People need to live near them to have good jobs. Of course, that changed a little bit with remote work, but it doesn't fully unbundle, and I think that's way too soon to expect that that will be sticky in a labor market for decades and decades to come. But also because preferences are changing. I think we saw from Dr. Chakrabarty's presentation, you see that 40 to 50% of people saying that they want to live in more of these dense environments and potentially in smaller houses. People always point to that statistic to me and they're like, well, that just shows that the majority of people want single family homes. If we allowed 40% of people to live in a denser environment, not only does that mean that they can live the way that they want to live, but that lowers the price, or at least the price appreciation of existing single-family homes, because people who don't want to live in them are not continuously forced to pick that because it's their only option. So I think it's really important to recognize that even small changes, if 40% of your built environment allowed for duplexes, how much zoned capacity have you created with that without forcing anyone who doesn't want to not live in a single-family home? I think it's really important to recognize that this is about providing choice for lots of people. And I think that one of the big things that happens when there are zoning reform debates is that there's this false dichotomy that's set up, where people say, it's either that we have to accept this change, or we're gonna maintain our neighborhood character and our community. This is not true. There's no way for anyone to maintain and preserve a community in amber. It's not possible. What happens when places don't update their zoning codes and don't provide the kinds of housing supply? Those communities change in ways that are often unexpected and unwanted. Homes become more expensive. People get priced out of them. The community becomes more homogenous when it comes to age ranges. You don't see people who are young families being able to move into communities that now have, big houses with older parents or grandparents now who can't live close to their kids. These communities do change, and we see this displacement risk happening. It's not happening just because there are, wealthy people trying to find housing and moving in, and developers are flipping those homes into, new apartment buildings. It happens because there's not enough housing supply to ensure that people can live near who they want to live in. It segregates different types of people, whether it's by wealth, whether it's by race, whether it's by age, whether it's by family type, and it creates a society that does not have that level of integration that people really want to see. People don't want to be forced to move out of their communities just because they're 65 years old and they can no longer afford their property tax. They want to be able to downsize and stay nearby their friends and family. They want to make sure that when their kids have kids of their own, they can also move there. I think this is one of the big reasons that AARP has become a big player in this space. And so I think that that's one of the things that's really important to underscore, is that there's no way to preserve a community in amber. There's a choice in either direction. If you don't build new housing and enough sufficient housing for the demand, your community is going to change in ways that you don't want it to change either, and your residents are not going to be happy in either way. So I think that one of the big problems in this conversation is often localities feel like they're being blamed for the housing crisis, right? I mean, I think that there's, been a lot of discussion around, the controversy around zoning reform, the controversy around state preemption, and viewing that as somehow an attack on municipalities. And I think that there's two important distinctions that have to be made. First, as everyone in this room knows, local government is where most of the important work of governing and people's lives actually happen, and most of the people who work in this are not doing it for the prestige or the money. You can raise your hand if that's you. But I think that that's something that it needs to be separated, is the concern about the way that local governments are structurally engaging with land use politics versus the individual people themselves, who are of course often extremely well-meaning and trying to do the best that they can. So I want to talk through some of the structural problems with how local land use politics works. So first is, of course, a pretty obvious point that everyone here, I'm sure, knows, that housing markets are regional. What happens in one suburb directly affects what happens in a city, what happens in 3 suburbs away. When someone's looking for a home in Salt Lake City, they are not just saying, I have a specific jurisdiction that I'm thinking about. They think about homes near good schools, homes near skiing, homes near hiking. They look at that entire array of potential options, and that crosses and spans several jurisdictions at a time. And so the decisions of every individual jurisdiction directly play onto the effect of everyone else. So this idea that just, someone's just doing what's best for their community, everyone is implicated in the decisions of every single community and what they choose to do with their zone capacity and what they choose to do with their housing supply and the types of housing they allow to exist. And just to underscore this point, I looked at the American Community Survey 2015 to 2019 before coming here. In that time period, 1 in 6 Utahns moved every single year. So when we think about who the people are, we often think about, oh, these are out-of-towners, these are Californians coming. These are just other Utahns who are moving around. And most of the moves are originating, they're within county moves, or they're between the 4 main Wasatch Front counties. So this is a situation where there is a lot of, there's no way for one county, one municipality to solve this on their own. It's very difficult. If one community decided to build tons and tons of housing, that's not going to change fundamentally the game if other communities don't also step up. And so that is one of the fundamental problems here. And so I think that one way, too, that local politics, really skews a lot of land use decisions is the way that local politics, it becomes very difficult to figure out what your constituents actually want and need. I'm sure that when you all are trying to figure out, how to plan for the future, you hear so many conflicting things, right? You hear, I want housing affordability, I want home prices to rise. Okay, I want to have, diverse communities. I want to make sure the neighborhood character stays like this. I want parks, but I want big lawns. It's not the role, of course, of government to execute to a T these contradictions. It's not possible. The thing that government has to do is decide, there are trade-offs to be made in each direction. Try to present those trade-offs to people, try to figure out what people want, but then also make decisions within the best interests of people. If for decades now, land use has, and it's not just in Utah, it's across the entire country, land use has deferred towards ensuring that we maintain single-family residential on large lots of land. And that has happened in Republican jurisdictions, in Democratic jurisdictions, in suburban ones, in rural ones. I think that everyone tries to think like, oh, we're all just doing our little thing here, but we have to understand that if everyone in the country is basically defaulting to very similar techniques, that's more about the structure of how local government is incentivized to respond to local political conditions than it is people actually acting in the interests of their specific community. Now, I want to talk a little bit before I end my remarks here about a case study that I was in Colorado. I was in the Denver area reporting on a big development that they were trying to pass, and they for complicated reasons, they needed to get a citywide vote in order to lift an easement to allow development to go forward. It was 155 acres, pretty directly in the middle of town, which is very rare, of course. It was a golf course, and you had the developer, I think, took great pains because they were forced to try to ameliorate community concerns. They set aside 2/3 of that land for open green space. They made sure that the housing had affordable housing in it at various levels of AMI. They ensured there was senior housing available and workforce housing. They also ensured that there were homeownership opportunities, that there was a promise to pay the increase in property taxes for a set number of years. There were a lot of decisions that were given to the community in order to try to make this go forward. In the end, the development did not pass. It lost by like 20 percentage points, which is in this day and age a decisive no from voters. That could be a signal, right? That's one signal of people really don't want change in their communities. They don't want growth. They don't want to see more housing. But at the same time, the same exact election that voters elected to object to this development, they also voted into power a mayor who was endorsed by the Yes in My Backyard local community that had openly and in defiance of boos, which I saw him take at various community meetings, said he supported the development. And he won his election, not just in the first, but also in the runoff. And at the same time, a year earlier, voters had been polled and showed that 60% of voters across Colorado supported reducing land use restrictions in order to increase more housing. So what does this mean, right? Like, I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier. Voters have competing preferences. Sometimes they're very confused preferences, and it's very difficult to discern what to do here. But I think that often the lesson being taken at the very local level, especially by people who face the electoral pressures in local government, is that people just don't want development. They just don't want it near them, and it's not going to work. But I think instead what we're seeing is that people are not aware often of the connection between the decisions they make on project by project, opposition or support, and the larger housing affordability crisis. They're not aware that when they say they want to preserve their minimum lot sizes or anything else, that they're adding $30,000 to their future homes that they're going to be purchasing. They're not aware of these kinds of trade-offs that are being made, and it's the responsibility of government and government officials, of course, to make them aware of this, but it's also the responsibility to make tough choices. I know this is a state that cares a lot about making tough choices when it comes to fiscal responsibility, and there are tough choices and tough votes happening on votes and different fiscal measures, and this is another place where tough choices have to be made, that people are going to have a lot of opposition, and we've seen this across the country, but over time they see that these changes do not destroy their communities. There was a 5-year fight in Minneapolis including 3 years of community input and outreach and changing the plans and suggestions for what they were going to do in the comprehensive plan. And people were really scared and upset, and there was a big opposition to passing the comprehensive plan that would upzone and allow triplexes across all single-family home neighborhoods. Now, I just visited Minneapolis. Almost nobody there cares. Why? Because it doesn't destroy communities to have 50 triplexes built over 3 years. There is a false understanding that when you allow these things to happen, that every single home in a community is going to be destroyed. But we all know in this room that land use planning is the planning of 50 years from now, 100 years from now. Everyone in this room is probably living in a home that's provided by the private market. 90% of Americans live in homes that are private market homes. The naturally occurring affordable housing, those were, at one point, expensive new homes. And if you don't build those, and we haven't for the last 50 years, you have to catch up now, or else it's us in this room, it's our children, it's our grandchildren. Those are the people who are not going to be able to have what was once promised to us when we were growing up. So I think that this is, obviously it's a very difficult political problem at the local level. I'm not going to pretend like this is something that's very easy to solve and to navigate, but I do want to just leave you with one thing, which is just that, in political science, there's this concept called the boundary problem, which is basically this idea that, it's very difficult to determine what the democratic body actually is, right? Because everyone in local government says, well, we want people who are closest to the decision to be included in the decision-making when we are deciding whether or not to build this development. You have to think about the impacts there. But, I live in DC now, and I was reporting on Arlington County in Virginia, which is bordering DC. They were having a fight of whether or not to allow a few changes to allow missing middle housing, nothing big. It was like 100 or 150 units a year, nothing major. And, someone at the meeting stood up and said, I'm suspicious that the people who are here in favor are actually from DC. And it was interesting, right? Because the comment she was making there is that there's no legitimacy to someone who does not live in this jurisdiction having an opinion on what Arlington County does. But people in DC, in that room who live in Arlington County, all of their jobs are dependent on the fact that DC is there. They work in DC, they work in industries that are dependent on the federal government. They themselves probably moved at some point, have lived in DC. Their kids intern inside DC. One day, if their kids decide to, move and want to find a house, they might live in DC themselves. So it's a very difficult problem because there's no way to give future people votes. That's not a real thing. But I think that the question here is when we're drawing the boundary of who counts, when we're thinking about the impact of new development and new housing, you can't just think about the people who are showing up at that zoning board meeting at 7 p.m. or 3 p.m. on a Tuesday. Those aren't all the people that matter, and increasingly we're seeing that as mayors, as city councilors are realizing how big their constituency actually is, we're seeing a lot more change on this issue. So, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jerusalem. Now we're ready for some Q&A, and we have the same two individuals walking around with a microphone. And if you can introduce yourselves and say who you're with, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay. Jerusalem, thank you so much for being with us today. We've already met each other, but I'm Andrew Gruber. I'm Executive Director of the Wasatch Front Regional Council, and just, Dina will make fun of me again for saying this, but I really am a fan, big fan, fanboy moment of your work. I've been listening to your work and reading your work for several years now, and I imagine this is true for a lot of the people in the room here. It's really helped to fundamentally influence and shape some of the way that we think about the work that we do, the planning work we do in transportation and housing. So just again, thank you so much for your work and for being here. I want to just pick up on sort of where you left off. You've talked today and also in your work about this sort of mismatch between the power and authority that existing residents have versus future residents. And in Utah, we talk and think a lot about the future. I think we do a better job of thinking about future generations than most places around the country. But the decisions around land use are made principally by, well, elected officials that are responsive to their current residents, and those current residents are understandably concerned about the potential impacts of growth that's coming. So arguably, you could say they have an outsized voice, and there's less thought in decisions about future generations. So my question, I guess, to you is it, how do we address that mismatch? And is it, in part, as you're saying, a sort of broadening the boundaries of who can have input into decisions? You were talking about geographic boundaries, but how do you broaden them temporally to future residents? And is there also, and that maybe is a structural question, but is there also a way to better appeal to existing residents so that rather than them thinking change is scary and bad, they can understand that there can be benefits to them as well, property values, amenities, whatever the case may be. What have you seen as effective in addressing that mismatch?
Yeah. Well, first, thank you. Anyone who reads my work, I'll just tally it up, send it to my editor. And so, yeah, I mean, big question. I think first is the reality that there's even amongst the people that we consider like residents of a town, there's already a mismatch, right, of who shows up to these meetings. Like, if an apartment building you don't really care about it, or a duplex you don't really care about it, then like you're not going to show up to the zoning meeting and be like, yeah, I'm fine. No one's going to do that, right? So when the people who have opinions registered are often going to be, there's massive selection effects, right? It's going to be people who have really strong opinions either on for pro or for against, so you really don't get the range of opinions that exist in the community, which usually are just like, I don't really care, is the average response to most of these things, or I haven't even heard about this. This isn't even a controversy in my brain. So I think the first step is just, and this has been successful in some places, is just showing community leaders that, the range of opinion in their own community is actually much broader than they would think. There's research on this. This is Einstein, Glick, and Palmer at Boston University show that the kinds of people who show up to these meetings are disproportionately, relative to the community, way disproportionately likely to oppose, more disproportionately like to be homeowners, more disproportionate to be much older. And so you're not getting the range even of the opinion of the people there. So I think the first step there is really making people aware of how many people are probably either fine or in favor of new housing going up in their communities. The second thing is I think, when you think about trying to care about making people feel the aggregate impact of the individual actions they're making, I think there's a real problem with project-by-project review, and that by right development is really important, and like trying to have these debates not about individual projects, but about like the holistic thing you're trying to do together as a community. And so like doing those debates as part of a comprehensive plan rather than subjecting every single like duplex to a community hearing or different things, that's gonna really change the nature of the conversation. When you invite people in and you say like, hey, we need to build for the future. These are the options. What would you like to do? You're still going to get a lot of people who are upset about it, but that changes, the amount of time that a city has to spend on every individual housing development. It means you can frees up a lot more time, resources. But given the speed with which I think communities need to act, you need to get to a place where you're not forcing every single project to come in front of and ask for a variance. So I do think that one of the big things there is asking people to think about that in a larger sense. Rather than, and I think I've seen comprehensive plans be much more successful, both in passing, but also in getting people not to get intractably focused on the details of one small project or the other. I'm sure all of you had this experience where someone has like the most like crazy tiny detailed concern about a development that like now it's going to spend you 15 hours to track down what the concern is, how you would even refute that concern, and often it's just like a hypothetical that's been raised because they read some comment on Nextdoor. And so, you know, you're setting yourself up for failure in this way when you have it set up this way. So I think that having all of that conversation, all of that kind of fight happening in one broad debate about values and how the community is going to grow and what the trade-offs are in each direction is, I think, a much more successful one. I think including future people, I mean, it's like not, I think it's, in large, I think it's just really very difficult for people to even think about themselves in the future. They don't think about the fact that they might move. They just think about their experience right now. And so one of the big things I think has been successful is like giving people a sense of what the scale of the change is going to look like, whether that's like artistically or whatever it is. Like, no one's talking about plopping skyscrapers in the middle of a suburb. Like, who would even want to live there? It doesn't even make any sense, right? So the question is, you show them beautiful duplexes and quadplexes that have happened and popped up in Nashville. You cannot tell unless you're one of those like weirdos like me that kind of gotta look for like the little mailboxes or whatever. Like, you're not gonna be able to tell that's not a single family home. It doesn't change the character of that. I think showing people who these kinds of people are and how that's changed is really helpful. But I think also it's just about having political courage. A lot of the times when people take difficult votes on this, they're usually vindicated because, 6 months, a year down the line, or whenever election year happens, there's very little change that's happened. Like, the zoned capacity, of course, does not materially change the nature of the community, the built environment that quickly. So a lot of people are experiencing a lot of fear-mongering from 1 or 2 or 3 people who are really entrenched in this, and then that coalition falls apart very quickly when they realize that the thing that they're terrified of, which is that their community is going to be overrun immediately with these things that they don't like and the kinds of people they don't want there, it's just not true. So yeah, I think that those are kind of the things that I would say on that. All right, I said everything that needs to be said on zoning. Okay.
Got a question over here. Hi, Megan McKenna, housing advocate for a nonprofit on the Wasatch Back, the other side of the mountains. I am also a really big fan. I've read and listened to a lot of your work as well, and I actually shared the Denver area golf course piece with a lot of my colleagues. I thought it was, it could have been, written about a recent project up here, a Dakota Pacific project that I'm sure everyone in here is aware of. But along the same lines, and I'm thinking of these, because this is the system that we do have right now, and we are going project by project in this review process. And I was just in a meeting last week where there were only 2 of us that spoke in favor of a project, and somebody spoke out in front of the whole group and said, the only 2 people in favor of this project don't even live here, even though it was within our county. And so I'm just wondering what advice you would have working within the system that we do have currently to effectively get that message across, that this is for the broader community and more future thinking than just in my backyard.
Mm-hmm. I will directly answer your question, but I mean, as a meta point, I actually don't think it's possible to really solve this problem if you continue the system the way that it works now. I think it's basically intractable. The political problem, no matter how well-meaning, I talk to people, planners, local elected officials who are trying very, very hard to work closely with their communities and develop in the way that's going to make those folks happy. Just the speed that we're talking about here is just not commensurate. So at some level, I think it's a very difficult problem if you feel like there's no political possibility of changing the underlying systems. I think on a more short-term timeline here, I mean, we've seen examples across the country of attempts to mobilize people in the community who are in favor of this type of housing, and also to inform local elected officials about how it's unlikely that these kinds of votes are really going to affect your election prospects. So I think that creating that cover, because I mean, just as the people who say no who show up to a meeting, people who say yes are often also very unrepresentative of the community as well. But if you say that if you show elected officials or whoever's in that meeting that oh, there's just as many of these people. Like, there's tons of people that we can find that will come up and say, I live on X street, and I've been in Utah my whole life, and I'd be happy for there to be duplexes show up. So I think that organizing work is something that's, I've talked to folks across the country. It's created a lot of political cover, and also changed the conversation in these places to be one of, both of these kinds of groups exist here. We need to do more work to figure out what actual community opinion is, instead of just defaulting to the 5 people who show up and are angry about it. But yeah, I mean, again, I don't believe this is a sustainable system in the long term.
Hi, Rosalba Dominguez, Murray City Council. I thank you for what you said. Is there any example nationally that has provided a good example of mixed use and mixed income? I think a big part of the conversation, what I've learned in coming into these sessions, is we don't talk enough about mixed income with development. And in my community, we're seeing a big transitional community that's being aged out. They no longer want to live in their single family homes, but there's nothing available for them to transition to once they retire or in that transition. Or I'm finding that we have multi-generational families living in one home because of the placement and locality of our city within the county. So when I'm talking to constituents, they're like, we know development's coming. We're not scared of it, but we want something that's attainable. And so I don't know if you know of any good examples nationally that has done this. Again, I do agree with you. There's more yeses than there are nos that show up to city council, but I think even in my role, I've made it a point to be very active with my constituents base in hearing them and talking with them and creating newsletters and creating forms of communication for them to really have an opinion, and even whether it's negative or positive, but just really having and engaging in those conversations. So I would love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, thank you. So I think a couple things. One, you're right, it's an extremely difficult political economy problem, and that new development is almost always going to be pretty expensive for people if you just allow the private market to do it, even if it's smaller. Of course, the question is, duplex is relatively less expensive than what a new single-family home would be, but that's not really, responsive to the needs of someone who's worried about making rent. That's just not really, they're not going to affording a $700,000 townhouse. So I think a couple of things here. One is that, there have been attempts to do this through inclusionary zoning. I think it's preempted in this state, so I'm not sure you can do that. I think that there are development agreements that you're able to do. I was just talking to Cameron about this. I got that right? Great. So, I think that most of the attempts to do this have been through IZ, which it's a tricky area because sometimes some communities use IZ to basically say no development will pencil out. You have to have 50% of your units be affordable to people under 25% AMI. It's just you're just trying to make no housing exist. So it's difficult. I think that the answer is just that new housing has never really been affordable to people who are in poverty or people who are in the working class. That's never been the case. Filtering is the concept. I'm sure that most people here in this know this about, new housing gets older, it filters down to middle income folks, filters down to lower income folks. All that naturally affordable housing one time was luxury new housing. And that's not really satisfying to some people, but I think that that's why we have to think about which lever we're trying to pull here, right? Because if we're trying to help people who are in deep poverty or who are on the brink of being evicted or being displaced, that's a poverty problem. That can't be solved by the private market housing. That's about vouchers, or it's about providing displacement risk if someone's about the risk of eviction, finding those people and connecting them to services before they lose their home. Those are, I think, different problems than I think the housing affordability zoning problem, which I think that it can't solve that. All it can say is it can help create the kind of abundance that means that when you do increase social supports, you don't actually price people out. And there's a study that looked at increasing vouchers in, I think it was a couple of Midwestern cities, and what they found is that people who got access to those new vouchers, they did a lot better. They were able to stay in their homes, they were able to find new housing, but low-income folks of the same level of socioeconomic deprivation who weren't getting access to those vouchers saw their rents increase because supply didn't change. of affordable housing. So, I mean, I think there are some things that some communities have done. I've seen in Montgomery County, and I think also in upstate New York, there's been attempts to create public housing authorities, and not like the kind of the old type of public housing, but one in which they're doing some interesting things with financing to create mixed income developments. Montgomery County, Maryland is a really, really great example of this. I'm not super familiar with the very particulars, but I would look into what they're doing. They just figured out a bond measure in order to build, I mean, several hundred units of housing within many different developments, and all of those are mixed income across a range of AMIs and above. Even I think like 120 AMI is also included, so it's really economically integrated. So yeah, there's some examples there.
Hey, I really appreciated your mention of the phenomenon we often see of hearing a lot from very few voices, and the challenge that that can pose as staff in feeling like the majority hates this project, and how that can warp kind of public perception of a project where really the majority probably is supportive of it. We just don't hear from those people. And that's kind of an issue we chronically have in the projects that I work on, is we hear from a select few. So I'm curious if in your work you have encountered communities who have effectively kind of like garnered feedback from voices that aren't typically heard. And I think we're trying to find ways to do that, and it's getting easier with different technologies available, but I'm always really interested to hear about communities who are having success in hearing from more than just kind of the frequent flyers.
Yes, I think one of the big things that I've seen is a more of a reliance on surveys rather than individuals who show up to different things. So there's surveys. I mean, I think it's quite difficult to do kind of like a hyper-local survey or something like that of your community, but doing like city-wide surveys or even county-wide surveys has been effective at getting kind of at least a baseline understanding of like what public opinion here is. But then also I've seen like canvassing being done, and canvassing early. One of the big problems that people, there's a belief in the community input kind of policy space that like if you do it really early and you do it really long, then you'll like solve the problem. And it's like, I just think like fundamentally not true. You can just like see it, I'm sure, in a lot of your communities, like you do a lot of community input, it doesn't really always work. And the problem is that the longer something kind of drags on, and there's a study about this around offshore wind in New Jersey, the longer any kind of political project drags on, the more that like people who are kind of in the middle just assume that there's something controversial or wrong with the project. And they'll just say like, okay, I'm against it now. And now offshore wind in New Jersey, a Democratic state, like that was, very pro a lot of green, policies, it's now underwater. Like a few years ago, it was a very popular policy. Now it's underwater with voters. And that's not because something changed about offshore wind. It's just that it dragged on so long that people were just like, there's something wrong here. And so I think there's one of the big things that I've seen that's been effective is at the very outset, and this is hard, of course, like getting buy-in both from the political side and also internally, that there is a timeline of which we're doing community input. This is the amount of time we're doing it. These are the range of potential outcomes we're saying at the very beginning, after talking with our community about what they're looking for. Like, this is the kind of thing we're trying to do with this project. And then providing people the chance to create input, like the ways they want it to change in there. But often what I've seen is that when you explain to folks that like there's not, like something is gonna happen here, they will then, not all of them, but you get much more engagement on the questions of what to do rather than whether or not to do it. And I do think that like deadline and really sticking firm with it, I've seen this in a lot of communities and again, a lot of communities around the country that are have been very intractable towards housing supply, including in, California suburbs, and which of course is like historically the place where you see some of the worst kind of opposition, have been much more amenable towards accessing and accepting more housing when you have that sort of approach. So I do think that part of it is just setting firm deadlines and saying, there's no more of this. Yeah.
I just wanted to get your thoughts on how rent control has been effective or not effective in cities.
Yes, so rent control is, and rent stabilization, I think they're two different things. So rent control, which are the post-war policies, particularly in like big liberal cities, I think most economists have found that those have been really harmful on net to both housing supply and also what ended up happening is that you have incumbent, renters at the very beginning were helped and aided in staying in their homes, but the turnover over time indicates those people a lot of times are actually not the people you're trying to help. I mean, I don't know if folks have friends in New York City who have access to rent-controlled apartments. A lot of times these are people who are making a lot of money, and it's not really clear to me if that's what these policies are meant to help. Now, rent stabilization policies, I think, can come in many different ways. There's rent stabilization policies that have been proposed but not like fully enacted in a lot of places, which there are a lot of differences with these policies. One is that they allow for some sort of appreciation of rent. Another is that they allow often for like vacancy decontrol. And another is that they come along, and to me, I think that like as a basket of housing policies, if you are liberalizing zoning, if you're making it much easier to build, if there's, if you have kind of right now, we don't see this with interest rates, but like if you have kind of the upswing of building, and you also want in the near term to make sure there's not a lot of displacement, rent stabilization can be a tool in the handbasket to ensure that there are communities that don't completely lose their homes in the short term. I don't think it's ever going to be a long-term solution to the problems we're talking about here, but I think a lot of the time there's not a recognition of like, prices are a really great mechanism for sorting in a lot of different ways, and you don't want to completely lose that market signal, but in the short term, even if everyone really got committed towards building a ton of affordable housing, building a ton of market rate housing, I mean, this is a problem that's come across 30 or 40 years. It's not going to be solved in like 2 or 3 election cycles. It's the problem of the next like 20 or 30 years of our lives. And what that means is like in the near term, are there places that deserve to have some level of stabilization? I think that's like up to the communities themselves, but I don't think it's a complete non-starter. And I think that there's been a lot of confusion on this about the economics because people are conflating control and stabilization policies as the same thing.
You talked about the regulations adding on to the price of a home, but my experience has been in numerous communities that even as those regulations are prohibited because the state legislature has stepped in and acted, impact fees have been decreased, that the savings isn't being passed on to the home purchaser. It's just adding more to the profit margin for the developer. And so how can we manage that disconnect? I mean, I feel like cities have done a lot to make those changes. A lot of them we've been compelled to make by the state legislature, but we're not seeing developers being held accountable for the fact that those costs aren't being, or those savings are not being passed on to the home purchaser.
Yeah, I think a few things here. One is that land use changes are not going to be seen in a matter of years. I mean, the changes you're talking about, it's like 2018, 2019, they began, and in earnest, like 2020. I mean, there's a lot that happened in the pandemic in that time to change home prices, but I also think the second thing is it's very difficult to know the counterfactuals in these places. When you do see counterfactual analysis done in other states and even other countries, New Zealand did very broad-based upzoning and saw actual rent declines, not just decreased appreciation, but declines wholesale, even as the pandemic was going on. So I think that like it's hard because the counterfactual here, it's very hard to explain to someone like, yeah, home prices went up 2%, but they would have gone up 5%. It's like not actually meaningful to people or like helpful in many cases. But I think that's the hard problem of like, decadal issues. Like you can't solve climate change in one policy or in 1 year. This is a problem that's going to take decades to solve, but it would be ludicrous for someone to say, well, we did this one water measure and that didn't end climate change. And that needs to be the kind of, I think, ethos that we bring to this problem as well, which is, yes, making some tweaks to ADUs is great, and even the outcome of that, meaning that more people can have access to the communities they want to live in and of itself, that's a win. That's more people getting to live where they need to live for their jobs, for their families. That's a 22-year-old who now doesn't have to pay their entire income to rent. They can stay with their parents. That's a mother-in-law who doesn't have to live on her own, that she can come live with a family who needs her help with a baby. Like, those are all policy wins that we should internalize, even if the housing affordability is not being realized in a matter of a year or two. But I think the big thing is to show people that in places that have done broad-based upzonings, you do see decreases in rent. Even the small ones, you can look across neighborhoods, places that did and did not. You see rent, you see the rent differential is like measurable and statistically significant. And so, I think it's hard, and I agree it's a very difficult political problem because that's not always very helpful to someone who's asking you to reduce their rent, but especially for homeowners already, I'm not really sure they're their mortgage is the same, so I'm not really sure how much that's gonna, affect them.
Thank you, Jerusalem, for all of this. This is fascinating. Meg Townsend, I'm with the Wasatch Front Regional Council. I want to ask a little bit about, how important is the home ownership component to solving this problem? In Utah, as we've scrambled to find ways to tackle the affordable housing issue, we celebrate these huge projects, all these units. We're celebrating quantity of units, which is fantastic. So much of that is rental units, and I think we're struggling to solve the home ownership piece of this, and we know home ownership is a key, one of the only ways for wealth generation for the lower mid and mid class. So, how do you see that home ownership piece of this?
Yeah, I mean, homeownership is really important to a lot of people, both for cultural reasons, but also for the wealth building opportunities. I think there are a few things. One is that, it's a real problem because a lot of the units that are going to first be created are, I think, often rental units. But that's why I think the missing middle conversation I know that you guys had this last year or 2 years ago, is really important because those homes are often homeownership opportunities, those duplexes and quadplexes. I mean, some of them actually already exist. Saskia was taking me around and showing me some of the housing opportunities that are even exist already in Salt Lake City. So, I think that's one of those things. That's why missing middle is so important, is because it does offer the opportunity for both densification, increased supply, and home ownership. I think, there's been, an overemphasis on homeownership for certain populations. Like, it's not that, there are a lot of people who are, I rent, who are renting out of college and who will rent, like, maybe even through their mid-30s and have, like, no problem with that. They feel the trade-off is fine, and they like the flexibility. They move for their work. They don't mind that. And so I think that it's, like, good to recognize. I think that 33%, of Utah are renters, and some of those people want to be homeowners, and some people are fine renting. I have my friend's parents. They lived in the Denver suburbs for a long time. Their kids all left the house, and they sold their home at top of the market, so they're very happy. And they moved into Denver proper, and they're renting. And so there are a lot of, I think the important thing I think to think about with this is that it's very, very difficult to. This is the political economy problem I was talking. Andrew raised earlier, is that it's very, very difficult to plan what every single unit is going to do, who is going to live there, the way they're going to live there. Like, zoning does not offer you that level of specificity. When you upzone an area and you say duplexes can be allowed in R1 district or whatever, like, you don't know who's going to live there. You don't know whether the person who lives there is going to rent it out. There's no way of making those certainties. So I think that's why it's really good to overshoot and provide a lot of flexibility in order to allow for a variety of different types to happen. And once you have that supply, it's much easier then to direct resources towards helping people get into homeownership. Right now, homeownership subsidies right now are, like, I think almost, like, adding them right now. DC tried to add, like, I think another 10 million or something like that to its local homeownership subsidies, and you're basically helping, like, 30 people get homes. The bang for your buck is so minimal because the housing supply is so small and what's available is so expensive. And so it's just like these programs become much more efficient at helping people get housed in the way they want to be housed, whether it's a homeownership or not, when you have the supply that can meet it. So.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Laura Hansen. I'm the State Planning Coordinator in the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget. I've been thinking about our housing challenges, and I think the solution is going to require a little bit of uncomfortable changes on everyone's part. I think the state is going to have to find ways to put more money towards affordable housing. I think cities are going to have to make some adjustments that maybe are a little bit uncomfortable. The thing that I've been stuck on and challenged with is, what is the role of the private development community? What are changes that they can make? If we're all in this together and we all have to make a few adjustments, what are some of the places where the private development community can give? And I think it's much, much easier to say, oh, well, let's let government fix it and let's make government make all the changes. But anyways, I'm curious on your thoughts on that.
Yes, so I think firstly, there will have to be a lot of change to how development works in a world where we're seeing, various types of homes get built and them servicing different types of people. I think that developers are extremely responsive to local government behavior and signals. I've not done a lot of reporting in Utah, but when I talk to developers across the country, they really, really take their cues from local officials, because they're repeat players. They know if they, burn bridges, like that's gonna really come up to bite them. People are usually very localized. Developers don't tend to travel tons and tons of jurisdictions or states. They're usually hyper-local players. They're usually like very involved in politics and responsive to signals from local government. So I think there's a few things that I think I could expect there to be changes. One is that people are very distrustful of developers. You all know this. People are very distrustful of developers, distrustful of what they're doing, distrustful of how they're doing it, distrustful even if, in the case where I was talking about the Denver, where this developer kept tacking on like sweeteners to the deal, like that made them more suspicious too. Like, well, if you could have done this from the beginning, why are you doing this now? And clearly you can do more, and you're trying to make a profit here. And so that's a real problem. I think transparency is very, very difficult. And transparency, I think, has to be led by local government about how development is happening and how decisions are being made around what types of projects are being promised. And this is why I think by right development is really, really helpful for reducing that level of distrust, because it creates a set of rules, and it doesn't create the situation where developers coming for a variance and it's like they are deal making, and it's not always like, it's not of course most of the time illegal, but like if you look at Los Angeles, a lot of times it's legal, but it's not always illegal. But a lot of the times you do see kind of like sort of like legalized corruption, where I was talking to one developer who called himself the developer of last resort in this one city. And he said the way that he did his job is that someone would tell him, whether it was a private person or it was someone in the government, like there's this lot of land and like the community there just like does not want to do anything about it, but it's really high value land if you get it. And what he does is he goes to the city and asks them, hey, what would need to happen for me to develop this land? And they're like, here's a list of people and institutions that will make a problem for you. You have to get them to say yes to your project, and then we'll be okay with it. And so this person goes around to these individuals. These are not elected people. These are not even always even community or civic groups. They're just sometimes just like individuals who create problems in an area for development, and they basically legally bribe them. What would you need to see in order for this to happen? Giving these people these outsized voice, and so then people sense that there's a problem in the process. They sense that like when these sweeteners are being added, who asked for it? Why is it that my community wasn't asked? Like why is it that this project by project development breeds a lot of kind of that mystery and distrust. And so, I don't think it's the fault of like any individual developer right now. This is the process that they're dealing with in the same way that this is the process local governments are dealing with. But I think that pushing for transparency and trying to reduce the level of randomness that can occur when people know this is zoned for X, this is the type of stuff that can be built here. There are there's not going to be a 10-story building that comes up tomorrow. Like that's just not possible. That really reduces the level of uncertainty. And for people, I think a lot of the times, like that kind of middle section of voters who are like skeptical of development, but not gonna like show up to, really oppose it, often those folks, they just need some certainty from you and from the process that like there's not going to be major shifts in what's gonna happen at the beginning to the end. Everyone here, I'm sure, has worked on a project where at the very beginning, the 3D model or whatever, or the rendering online looks very different than what happens at the end. That's necessarily going to be a part of the process, but when that's not understandable to most people, like why is it changing so much? Why is it that they got X number of things, and like why is it that they said they were going to keep this historic facade and like now it's completely different than what I thought? That's the sort of thing where you have to provide people with consistency. I think developers should be really good at taking the lead from cities. I often think that like city-led development plans just anecdotally seem like they're a lot more palatable to people than if it feels like a developer's just coming in here and doing something on their own. But yeah, I think that's kind of the changes I expect.
Great. Again, help me thanking Jerusalem for her comments and her ideas that she's presented today. We'll now take a break till 1:45, and then we'll hear from Dr. Nelson. Thank you.